Australia, the great outback, the beautiful continent underneath the gigantic Asian continent. Modern-day Australia is home to many wonders, beautiful jewels, an amazing landscape, and many unique species of animals. Australia has become a new power for what many thought was only a useless hunk of land. However, Australia's history has had a clouded and dark past. The natives were once free and practiced a beautiful culture they had created. Unfortunately, terrible treatment forced them to conform to the colonists. Life for the Aborigines changed forever. From the moment the first explorations of the land started, the encounters and exchanges between the native Australians and the Europeans were set in stone. This is Australia. The first accounts of Australia being found was by a Dutch sailor named Willem Janzoen. Janzoen commandeered a small skipper named the Doifiken under the Dutch flag. While on a trip to Indonesia, his ship was swept aside by a storm, straying the ship from its initial path. This stray on the path led him to the east coast of Australia, on Carpentaria. The year was 1605 to 1606. His written accounts of the Australian coastline was the first about the land south of Asia. While in his exploration of the new land, a mutiny broke out on the board. The mutiny was shut down, but the two leaders were left behind on Australia to rot. These two people were actually the first Europeans to live on Australia.
Captain James Cook of Britain accidentally landed on Australia on May 1777, thinking it was a mythical land full of treasure. His ship, the Endeavour, was a research vessel under the British Navy. When he had landed on the continent, he was met with new land and fauna. His exploration of Australia was extraordinary. He wrote the rough and dry terrain of the land, its arid weather, and Australian wildlife. He claimed countless square miles of land for the British and studied each part very carefully, filling up a multitude of journals. He had named iconic places in Australia such as Botany Bay and Port Jackson. His specific details of the animals, such as the iconic kangaroo and koala, were precise to the hair. Another one of his exceptional discoveries was his encounter with the Great Barrier Reef. On the way to what is now New Zealand, his ship, the Endeavour, was struck by one of the many corals in the reef. He investigated into what became the Great Barrier Reef. His recordings of the hundreds of species living in the reef proved informational. It's effortless to say that James Cook was a huge contributor to Australia's history.
If any person were to disregard James Cook for his contributions to exploration of Australia, the next person to come to mind who had equally beneficial achievements would be Captain Matthew Flinders of England. Flinders set sail for Australia in 1801 on a ship known as the Investigator. His accomplishments on Australia are fairly amazing as well. Flinders became the first to circumnavigate around the continent. He mapped the coast of Australia and the surrounding islands. Furthermore, Flinders also mapped the terrain inside of Australia and drew pictures of many geological landmarks. His maps were extremely detailed for a cartographer and sailor at the time. He theorized and proved that Tasmania was a separate island from mainland Australia. He claimed many more acres of land for Britain under the king's name. As a geographer, his contribution through the use of maps became beneficial to the colonies of Australia later on.
In 1788, the first fleet of colonists and convicts arrived under the leadership of Governor Arthur Phillip. The fleet was mostly made of women and convicts with all the necessary supplies for survival. Upon arrival onto Botany Bay, the fleet were met with a bewildering sight. They were greeted by the natives of the land, the Australian Aborigines. This was the first encounter between the colonists and the natives of Australia. The relations between the two groups of people were peaceful, as colonists relied on the Aborigines for food and knowledge of the land, and in return, the colonists offered their tools and English goods. In fact, Robert Burke and William Wills, German explorers working for Britain, stated in their separate journals that the natives presented them with many fish and even offered their women. Even though relationships were peaceful, the colonists thought of the Aborigines as barbaric and uncivilized people. Ironically, as hardships began to overcome the colonists, they were left with no choice but to rely on the natives for survival. Governor Phillip had instructed the colonists to establish the first British colony in Australia. Despite that, the first fleet were unprepared for the task, for the soil around Sydney Cove was poor. The colony had to rely on developing farms around Parramatta, as well as trading between local clans to survive.
In 1790, the Second Fleet arrived in Sydney, and with them, Philip Gidley King, who would become the third governor of New South Wales. As an admiral and trusted adversary by the Queen of England, he was granted the position of Governor of New South Wales. Governor King was a strict governor who ruled the land with power. One of his coldest enforcements was when he legalized the shooting of the natives. He believed that the Aborigines were barbaric people, primitive human beings that need the help of the English. With good intentions, Governor Gidley Phillip set laws to put the native Aborigines under British restraint for the purpose to turn them into sophisticated humans. The British attempted to civilize the Aborigines by showing and teaching them their ways of life, such as how to build and farm. They placed Aborigines in settlements and schools. Unfortunately, these methods did not work, for the Aborigines would leave and return back to their tribe. The British had no choice but to use brutal methods. The British forced Aboriginal tribes to fight one another. Usually this meant that Aboriginal tribes would be wiped out from their feuds. The British even ordered their men to capture young Aboriginal children and send them to institutional camps. At these camps, children were beat near to death if they were to misbehave. The Aborigines saw these methods as inhumane and as a result would rebel against the British, but were immediately suppressed. Aborigines were captured and tortured ruthlessly as example for the minorities. The suppressive and torturous ways of the British were only one of the downfalls for the native Aborigines.
Besides the cruel treatment of the natives, the British had diminished and destroyed Australia's ecosystem and natural resources. By taking precious minerals such as diamonds, gold, and important fossil fuels such as coal, the British gained a large amount of wealth, which subsequently led to the depletion of natural resources. British settlement does not stop there, for the British would chop down hundreds of trees, which are food sources for many, such as koalas and marsupials. The British also managed to kill many native animals, such as emus, great kangaroos, and dingoes, by blocking up Aboriginal-made waterholes. The colonists also hunted kangaroos and fished for sport. As many native animals began to slowly decline, the British brought over many of their domesticated animals, such as cows, sheep, and rabbits. These animals took over fertile areas and fouled the land. To make matters worse, many diseases such as smallpox and measles brought over by the British were contracted by the Aborigines, resulting in numerous amounts of deaths. Over 60% of Aborigines died from these diseases.
Australia became what it is today through a dark history. The influence of Europeans in the continent was a driving force for Australia. It became a world power, strong in natural resources, and owned a unique ecosystem. However, the success of Australia had a cost. That cost was the millions of Aboriginal people dead, tortured, and forced to live by European standards. The decline of a native life and culture almost disappeared from the world. A world with dominant cultures from Europe, Asia, and America take over the minorities. The Aboriginal culture was taken over and covered up. The leftover 40% were either forced to live where the British did not want to, or live with the British. By 2001, close to 2 centuries after the first colonies were set up, only 2% of the 22 million people in Australia are of indigenous origin. This number is staggering, but an example of the brutal ways of how Australia was started. But what if Europe did not interfere with Australia at all?
Australia is a very prosperous and rich country. But our country is gifted with a lot of natural resources. It's a wealthy country, and that wealth has been built on the dispossession of Aboriginal people. Those resources, the land, that was Aboriginal land. And I can't hazard a guess as to what would have happened had we not been colonised. But I suspect we'll probably be a wealthy Aboriginal country today.
Australia is the home of millions of people today, of all different races. It's a wonderful place with plenty of unique animals and plants. The country owns an amazing landscape and terrain no other continent has. It has a history like none other as well, from a mere prison colony to a bustling city with a thriving economy. A fair share of thorough exploration, encounters with the many wonders with this land, and exchanges that affected the world economy and consequently an entire culture is what makes Australia, Australia. But what if Europe did not interfere with Australia at all?